Hi folks, my name is Jessica Pierce. I work for the National Council and I will be our moderator today. And so I want to get started. I'll let you know that we plan to go over our time by only about 2 or 3 minutes, and instead we're going to just try to really be focused so that even though we have these delays because of the audio, we won't be behind. So I wanted to let you know that we are sponsored by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and as you can see from their vision and also their mission, their goals align, I would think, with most of the work that we do in juvenile and family courts, and particularly around those folks that are coming into the system because of child abuse and neglect, because of substance use. Our jobs align with this OJJDP mission of making sure that all of the kids that come to court are heard and that they feel safe and that whatever happens is an appropriate intervention. This is sponsored by Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and we are the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. All right, so today, our learning objectives. We're going to talk about the reasons why it's really important to get lived experience from people who are going through the system. They are your users, and so it's important to hear back from your clients, from your audience, from your consumers about how well you're doing. We want to find out about how there's a difference between that surface level engagement and system level engagement, and how you can make sure that you are being really mindful of how you are engaging with court users. And then finally, we want to talk about engagement strategies that lead to authentic involvement in systems improvement. So the way we're going to approach this today is that I want you to think about everybody who is participating as being an expert. So we have with us some training and technical assistance experts here from the National Council. We have a couple of folks who do have lived experience in the child welfare system. And then we also have all of you. And so today we're going to actually ask all of you to be responding as well to how you are engaging folks with lived experience in your system change efforts. And so there's going to be 3 different questions we're going to ask today, and I'm going to ask you to respond to those questions in chat. And hopefully then that'll give everybody who's participating a chance to learn from their peers. We're also going to hear from our youth who were formerly in foster care, and then we'll also hear from the training and technical assistance providers. So with that, I'm going to ask for folks on our panel to introduce themselves. And so I'm going to start with Mark Funkhauser from the National Council. Mark.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Funkhauser, and I'm a site manager for the Child Welfare Department at the National Council. But I was a probation officer for 23 years in Indiana, and actually I'm a person in long-term recovery regarding mental health and addiction. I'm also a certified peer specialist and a community health worker, and so I've done some training mostly in the state of Indiana for peer support and for community health work. So,
thanks, Mark.
thank you.
We're happy to have you on. I know you always bring such a wealth of experience from both your professional and personal lives. And Andrew, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Jessica. I'm Andrew Wachter. Just like Mark, I'm also a site manager with the National Council. I work primarily with juvenile courts with jurisdiction over child welfare cases to improve hearing practices and improve outcomes for children and families. I'm excited to join the panel today and share ways that courts can engage people with lived experiences and learn from other courts how they've joined, that have joined us today about their own efforts.
All right, great. And then we have with us Hannah, who is a person who has gone through the foster care system and can talk a little bit about how they've been engaged in that work. Hannah.
Hi, yeah. So my name's Hannah. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm currently 23 and I live in Oregon. And I was in foster care from the ages of 14 until I aged out at 21. And throughout my time in care and then also like after I've aged out, I've been involved in different committees that have been put together to sort of come up with improvements to be made to DHS. I've also been involved in a lot of different advocacy groups like Oregon Foster Youth Connection. that Macy and I are both a part of. And with OFYC, what we call it, I've been able to like speak on different panels, to talk at foster parent trainings, caseworker trainings. I actually just got off a meeting with the Director of Child Welfare in Oregon to talk about permanency. And so I do a lot of different work in that regard. And then also with OFYC, we have policy conferences, and we actually come up with policy recommendations and lobby legislators to help get legislative change in Oregon. And we've passed previous bills like the Sibling Bill of Rights. And then our current push, or our most recent push, has been to expand independent living program services, and so to expand like the funding for those services for youth transitioning out of care.
Thank you, Hannah. And our final panelist today is Macy, and they are joining us via text because of our challenges with the audio. We weren't quite able to get Macy's audio to work. So I asked Macy to write their bio into the chat for you. And what you can really see with Hannah and Macy is that the folks in Oregon are really taking it really seriously, that they want to have that youth voice as part of the work that they're doing. And so you can see that Macy is currently an intern in Oregon, probably spent more time thinking about family first than I have, I would think. I mean, it's not necessarily my area of expertise, but I can see that Macy is spending a lot of time working on this and talking with the folks in Oregon to make sure that this works for the youth in Oregon. Like Hannah, working to make sure that things are better for the kids in foster care in Oregon, including working with the Oregon Foster Youth Connection and their policies and recommendations. And so I think it's really important for all of you as system actors to really hear from the people who are receiving your services, especially judges. That you have such an opportunity to make changes in these kids' lives. And so how can we make sure that you're hearing from them? Andrew, I'm turning it over to you to talk a little bit more about this.
Thanks, Jessica. And sort of just a starting point about what we mean with people with lived experiences. There are lots of different people with varied backgrounds and experiences that come before the courts, and they're valuable to engage and gather their perspectives. These individuals have firsthand experience that can inform policy and practice decisions in a really positive way. It's important to understand how court policy and practice affect those that come before the court, and it's important to bring a diverse representation and really deepen the engagement of those with lived experiences to allow them to be heard and ensure that they're valued. You see here on the slide, there's a variety of groups of people who have been or are currently involved in certain circumstances that can be valuable for courts to include. They include individuals with experience in substance use, mental health challenges, domestic violence, and on a more broader term, just being involved in the juvenile and family court system as well as the child welfare system. Those are experiences as well. I just want to point out quickly that much of today's discussion will focus on people who are currently involved or who have been involved with the juvenile and family court system due to substance use. However, many of the strategies and practices we talk about today can be applied to other people with lived experiences. We attempted to include some adults involved with the court due to substance abuse disorders, but were unable to. And honestly, that's because we didn't allow enough planning on our end. And so it was kind of a lesson learned for us about, and it underscores the importance of thoughtful planning to include people with lived experiences. It should be something that we do on a routine, systematic basis, and not just an afterthought or a one-time thing. While we weren't able to engage those with court experience due to substance abuse disorders, we are grateful to have Hannah and Macy to speak about their engagement with courts and the child welfare system from their perspectives as former foster youth. Now that we know what we mean when we talk about people with lived experiences, let's talk about a few different ways or methods that people with lived experiences can share their experiences. These apply to those with opioid use disorders, as well as others like former foster youth or former delinquent youth, etc. Exit interviews are a great way to gather input at the end of a process, for instance, at the conclusion of a case or perhaps exiting foster care or completion of a treatment service. Including people with lived experiences in stakeholder committees is a great way to bring them to the table and include them in a structured and systematic way. People with lived experiences can also help review policies and participate in the development of those policies. People with lived experiences can also be great advocates for funding and other resources, such as treatment options. Many people with lived experiences can also share their experience as a mentor or peer support for others. For example, a peer support or recovery support for those with substance abuse disorders. Lastly, people with lived experiences can be involved in participatory research to evaluate court programs or court processes as well. Before we turn to the audience, I'd like to ask Hannah and Macy to chime in briefly if they've participated in any of these activities or any others that maybe weren't on the list. Hannah, if you'd like to go first, and then Macy can type in the chat, perhaps.
Yeah, so I've actually been able to be involved in everything on this list. So with exit interviews, like I've been asked about my experience in foster care and like how I liked my independent living program workers and my caseworkers. And then I've been on several different stakeholder committees, like I mentioned previously. Like I was on a committee with some judges, attorneys, caseworkers, independent living program workers, and other foster youth, and we were all collectively trying to come up with an improvement that could be made that we could send to the state level to have some change happen in our county, so that was really awesome. With policy development, I've been involved in work that Oregon Foster Youth Connection has been able to do, and I've lobbied and talked to legislators. I've done a lot of advocacy work, and for the mentorship, peer support, and training, I was able to be a part of Foster Club's All-Star Internship, and I believe their website is linked on this app. So, but I was able to be involved in different trainings with other fellow former foster youth, and then we were able to go to different, like, what do you call those? Different conferences with other foster youth and just talk about our experiences. And so that was really awesome. So yeah, I've been involved in a lot of different things.
And so Macy says that, that they've been fortunate to participate in all of these different things and has asked for some specific examples. And of course, in their introduction, Macy included a lot of specific examples, including intern for state representative, have been at many Family First legislation implementation planning meetings, worked with the peers to create Oregon Foster Youth Connection policy and recommendations, and OFYC bills, and as well as being part of the panels for judges and foster parents. And so both Macy and Hannah, if you have anything else you'd like to add, please feel free to do so. And Macy, you're saying you've been an intern for the representative Kenny Geyer there in Oregon. And we have with us Lisa from the OFYC, and she works with these youth all the time. So Lisa, you wanted to add something to this?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add that in addition to that list, that you can use people with lived experience when you're creating those things, when you're designing what they might look like, when you're pre-testing them. So don't wait until you've determined here's what mentorship is going to look like, and we've created a program, and then you ask people for feedback on it, include them from the beginning, and that we need to be willing to do things differently, and we need to also just be really able to hear and ask clarifying questions versus interpret what youth are saying, or anyone.
Yeah, Lisa, I think that's kind of a mistake we sometimes make as adults when we're working with teens or young adults, is that we sometimes think we know what they're saying and we speak for them, and that can be part of the problem. So for folks, we want to hear from you now, and so I want you to type your answers to this question into chat. What are you currently asking people with lived experience to help with in your jurisdiction? So what things from that list are you doing? And then also, what other things are you doing? And be as specific as you can be, because we're hoping, again, to make this sort of a crowdsourcing where everybody is going to learn from everybody else. And our panelists are going to be watching the chat, and I'm going to ask them to comment periodically on some of the things that they're seeing coming out of your jurisdiction. So we'll be doing that as we see the responses coming in.
It looks like many folks are typing, so we'll just wait a second till we get some responses here, and then we can elevate them.
That's right, yes. There is a little bit of a delay in this online process, but I think we'll have a good conversation. Right, so we can see here that, like, Juhi Berry is saying that they ask for the youth to do some advocacy work, writing to legislators for continuing funding for the mentoring program by OJJDP. That's a cool idea. Mark, what are you seeing come in?
A couple of people, Kimberly Turner and Sarah McKenzie, talking about foster parent training. So maybe bringing in former foster youth who could help educate, foster parents on how to be a better parent in the system.
Yeah, I think that's one of those times where you don't know what you don't know, and having folks who have been through it from the other side can really help provide a different perspective. Andrew, what have you seen come into the chat?
I just noticed Barbara mentioned using people with lived experiences for community awareness and education. So using that information that they gather in a broader sense, not just to inform what they're doing in the courts, but actually to inform the community about that work, which I think is amazing. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I think there's always a little bit of a disconnect between folks in the community and folks in the court system and, kids in the foster care system. There's lots of myths out there in communities, and so when folks who have that lived experience can go out and talk to people, that really can help, can change perspective.
I also just want to point out that Lisa mentioned that the youth were involved, the youth that we have on the line today, were involved in creating a tip sheet for judges to be respectful to people who identify as part of the LGBTQ community.
I think that's really important too, because the way that kids are experiencing their lives now may feel different for adults and for judges, and so to have those voices willing to kind of say, here's what we prefer, here are our pronouns, here's how to be respectful of us, can be really, really helpful, because sometimes we just don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, it helps to personalize that experience.
Exactly, and I see a lot of peer support as well. It seems like for kids themselves who are in the foster system, that it is helpful to hear from somebody else who has been through that same thing.
I have a comment on what John Hudson and David P. said. So just John saying that he works on the state level and they seek lived experience on your steering team and your subcommittees, and I just love to hear that because that's really awesome. But just one thing that I would say about that too, just because I have been involved in like steering committees and subcommittees, to make sure that you're having the committees in an accessible format for all your people with lived experience, and whether that means that you are allowing people to join by phone or by video or different things, or what time you're having those committee meetings at. I would just be really cognizant of like what's going on in the lives of the people who you have on that team who do have lived experience. And then I love that David said that We are using peer support counselors during our in-person visits, lived experience from 10 to 20 years. That is awesome. I think that with in-person visits, it's really great to have someone in the room who can relate like directly to what you've experienced. And so I would just like encourage you to continue that, and I think that's really cool.
All right, so I'm going to just wrap up this question and ask, Mark, did you see anything else that came in as we were talking that you wanted to highlight?
You know, I think using, you know, some of the things I've seen here reminds me of a program in Delaware where they're pairing a former parent who was in the system with a social worker. And it runs along the lines of, you know, putting those people directly, you know, into the work with the parents and probably even the children in the child welfare system. So there's so many angles with regard to peer support.
Yeah,
you know, talking to. So,
I think we often think of peer support as being just for kids, but adults and foster parents really can use that, or parents who've had their children taken away could use the peer support as well. Andrew, any final thoughts?
No, I think that I like all the conversation that's been going on. There's great ideas in the chat there. If we want to talk a little bit about some of the different experiences that people can share their input on that's valuable to the court. The first slide talked a little bit about the methods that people can participate in. This gets a little bit more to the subject matter, if you will. The list you see here is geared a bit towards those with substance use disorders involved in child welfare proceedings, but some fit, again, a variety of different situations. Parents can talk about the removal of their children due to a substance use disorder, what the drug testing is like, what the frequency, the privacy around drug testing, visitation limits and family time from the parent's perspective. You know, what was the frequency? How often did you see your kids? In most cases, kids will return to their parents, so frequent visitation is crucial to reunification. So, you know, including those individuals is important to get feedback on the court's current visitation policies and practices. Another great area that they can share feedback on is access to treatment and the quality of that treatment. Engagement in hearings. How well did you feel you were asked about your feelings in the hearings? Were you given the opportunity to be heard? This information is really crucial for judges and judicial officers to engage parents and children in their hearings. Family time or visitation with parents while in foster care. So from the youth's perspective, what were those visitations like? What was the difference between supervised and unsupervised? So they can really provide a lot of valuable information from their perspective, and also what their experience was like being removed from their parents. Again, before I turn to the audience and ask you all a little bit about this topic, I wanted to ask Hannah and Macy again about the types of experiences that they've been asked to give their input on. And Macy, again, you can feel free to type in the chat.
And Andrew, it looks like Macy has typed a couple of things here in chat. And I don't know if these are suggestions that they're making or actually advice that they've been asked to provide, but I think they're super timely. First, they say police and youth interaction, and then they go on to clarify, saying meeting youth who have had trauma around police, trauma informed. And I think that with what we're seeing with all of the protests and with Black Lives Matter, that it's really important to think about when youth are coming in contact with the police, what that interaction looks like. And so frequently it seems like it's a negative interaction, and it doesn't have to be. But police have to be willing to change, and I think that can be hard. Hannah, what would you like to add?
Yeah, so I was just going to say, I think someone mentioned that like this list can be intimidating, but really I think, at least in my experience in the foster care system, I had a caseworker who had like made a decision about where I was living or something legal. I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly what it was, but she didn't consult with me first, like what I actually wanted. And I was a teenager, and I can, like, I'm more than able to make decisions in my life and, like, figure out what I want. And so I think that this list is actually really, really short, and youth can provide, well, and people with lived experience in general can provide input on any sort of system or practice that is going to be affecting their life. I think that they'd be able to provide input on that, and since, you know, those decisions are going to be directly affecting them, they're going to be able to provide input that is going to improve your system, and they have a direct impact. And so I think that they're going to be able to provide information on what's working well, what's not working well, and they could provide suggestions on, like, what you could do better. And so I think that this list can go beyond longer, and there's a lot more that people can provide input on.
Absolutely. And I think people should be creative about what they get input on. And I think a lot of times you do have youth and other folks with lived experience who pipe up, and too often we say, yeah, whatever, and we don't think about that idea that they've brought to the table. And it really is on the folks in the system to listen to those voices and take those suggestions seriously. I do want to read out what Macy has written here, because I think it's really powerful, and I really appreciate Macy typing all of this, I think, on their phone. So it's I really appreciate it. So Macy, you say that you're responding from the point of view of being the youth who would have gone through these things. You feel that it depends on the youth. If you've gone through it, I feel you are needed as input. No one knows it better than the one who's lived through it firsthand. Youth need to be able to voice their facts on the issues, because if there is no youth voice, there may not be real lasting results. In this case, the youth knows what's best. Being the youth who has gone through these things, I feel it depends on the youth. If you've gone through it, I feel you're needed as input. And no one knows it better than the one who's lived through it firsthand. Youth need to be able to be the voice, their facts on the issue, because if there's no youth voice, there may not be real lasting results. Especially, you know, thinking about just for a specific youth, but then Macy goes on to say mental health, housing, foster homes, foster parents, trauma, etc. And so I think it's really important for us to think about that youth voice for specific youth level issues, and then also those system issues. So I'd like to ask all of you now to write in chat, what have you asked people about in your jurisdiction? So what kinds of questions are you asking? So this should be where you're typing in chat things that you ask the people with lived experience to give you feedback and input on. And Lisa makes a really great point here. Lisa, do you want to unmute and expand on that a little bit?
Sure, yeah, just that that I think one of the things that I'm relating to the current movement right now is that there's a lot of white people who have opportunity to learn about the Black experience through research and education versus expecting the Black community to educate white people. And I want to relate that to this too, that when you ask someone to think about traumatic things from their past, that's traumatic, and that we need to be clearly preparing them to do that opportunity, supporting them while they're participating, and then debriefing with them after the fact. And that if someone's going to take their time and their emotional space to share their thoughts with you, to make sure that you really understand what they're asking you for, and ask, again, clear, open-ended questions to make sure that you're understanding their thoughts, and then maybe even take it the next level further and give them feedback. If you're like, okay, I can do, you've given me 3 points. We can do number 1, no problem. Number 2, here's a barrier. And number 3, there might be a challenge.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And then I also wonder, do you think it's important when we have folks with lived experience that are participating kind of in that group setting on those advisory boards, that everybody kind of has some ground rules about sort of how to interact? Because I can imagine that folks that are part of a steering committee where you have like a youth or somebody with who's in recovery, they might be inadvertently asking questions that can trigger trauma or make that person feel really uncomfortable because they don't want to disclose something in that kind of setting. So do you recommend giving sort of ground rules to those kinds of groups?
I'm sorry, can you ask that question the short version again? I was reading something.
Sure. The short version is, do you think that when we ask people with lived experiences to participate on steering committees or in other big groups, that there should be some ground rules for the group about how to interact with that person with lived experience?
I think I would like to have Hannah answer that question if you're able to.
Yeah, I can answer. So like ground rules based on how to interact with the person with lived experience. I would just say any kind of meeting that I've gone to where we're on a committee or something like that, the very first thing we do is come up with ground rules altogether. And so I don't think it needs to be some kind of official thing that you hand out to everyone, but rather like it's a case-by-case basis on, how they want to be treated in that committee or like in that situation. But I would also just say, like, knowing that, I would err on the side of caution when asking them to share, just because it is like really hard to share experiences you've gone through, especially if they've been very traumatic for you. And if you can sense that maybe they might be uncomfortable, I would try not to push too far. But also don't be afraid to ask questions that like you don't know whether or not they might want to share, because they can always say no. But when that situation does happen, just respect that and move forward and move past it. But yeah, I think that a lot of it comes from learning like what individuals are comfortable sharing about, because I'm going to be really comfortable sharing a lot of my story, but I know a lot of people who might not want to share so much in their story. So it really depends.
That's a really great point, Hannah. And I think Macy kind of chimes in here to say, when it comes to youth voice, having more than one youth there is always best. It gives you a variety of answers and also gives different youth who've had different experiences. Doing a youth panel is one very good way to get diverse answers. And I think that you'll find with a variety of youth, you'll get different levels of comfort sharing different parts of their stories. And then also, it helps prevent that sort of tokenism that can come when we have folks participate with lived experience. So while we've been having this conversation, I see that there are lots of responses that have come into chat to our question. So I'm going to turn now to Mark and ask if you have anything that you've noticed in chat that you wanted to elevate.
Yes, John Hudson earlier talked about the impact of the removal process and how if it's absolutely necessary to do that, to ask, them what resources do they think are needed, what transportation, treatment, basic assistance, and how to provide those resources to prevent that removal as well.
So really talking about that sort of from a resource perspective rather than from a deficit perspective, and how can we help support those folks in that time. Andrew, what are you seeing coming in?
A few things about, again, engaging them about their child welfare experience, engaging them about their experience in the court process, and specifically around the hearing process. Again, John talks about developing a core a full that they can share and build upon. So I think there's some great ideas that are being generated in the chat there about what folks across the country are doing and asking people with lived experiences to comment on.
All right, so let's move right on to the end where we talk about how we can increase that participation, which we've already sort of started talking about.
Yeah, I think this works well and plays off of what we kind of just heard in terms of encouraging authentic participation. Think about providing a few different things to help people with lived experiences, like access to childcare for parents that may want to be able to participate in meetings, training on public speaking. A lot of the folks, you know, when you just start to engage them, may not feel comfortable having those conversations in large groups or public speaking, and so providing them some training on how to do that is really important. Stipends, find a way to pay people for their time. That might be in a simple check. It could be gift cards. It could be public transportation vouchers to get them to and from meetings. I also noted here sharing power. I think that's really important, that when we ask people to join the courts at the table and in these stakeholder groups, that there's an ability to recognize that they have a voice, and that to meaningfully engage them in the process means sharing some of that power and really letting them have the ability to have input into policy and practice.
Right, so let's hear from Hannah and Macy about any strategies that have been used with you to help you participate.
Yeah, so I love that you have in here like sharing power, because I think that I've left certain events or committees when I feel like my voice isn't heard. So like, yes, I've been invited to be involved, but it sort of turns into a situation where I'm more of like a token than actually having my voice heard and valued. And so I would say if you are wanting to involve people who have lived experience in different things that you're doing in your system, make sure that you are actually taking what they say and using it, and using it to create change, implementation, different things like that. Because people notice when what they say is not really being heard, and we don't want to be involved in things that are like that. So we can tell. And I would say stipends, and also somehow providing transportation, or like sharing what transportation options are available, and that's another thing, like making sure that when you're doing things that people with lived experience can be participating in, make sure that they have access to transportation. It's at a time that works with their work schedule. Just making it as accessible as possible. And so that's going to get them involved more. And, with the stipends, I think that is actually really important, because if you're asking this person to take time out of their day to oftentimes rehash all these different traumatic experiences they've had, they're going to be way more incentivized to participate if they actually do have a stipend that is going to compensate them for that time.
Yeah, as system professionals, we all get paid to be part of these groups. And so it would be silly for us to expect that people with lived experience would just want to volunteer their time. And so I think you're totally right that we need to pay people for spending their time doing this work with us. So I want to ask the group then, how are you increasing or ensuring long-term and authentic participation? So go ahead and type in chat the kinds of strategies you use. Maybe things that we missed on our list, or creative ways that you've been able to get like stipends funded. All of those things are really useful for us to share experience here.
Jessica, I'll just chime in while they're typing. I will. The experience that I had in terms of organizing stipends for the participants, Hannah and Macy, to participate today, was an interesting conversation with Lisa, because I didn't consider that they may not have checking accounts, and we have to get creative and find different ways to give those stipends, whether it's Venmo or other electronic means of transferring funds, which was an interesting learning experience for myself.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really coming to the forefront here in this conversation is that we have to be really mindful when we invite folks with lived experience to participate. So the folks, when you're organizing this, you want to have those kinds of things figured out before you invite people with lived experience. And so Lisa has a nice long list of things that she's offering. And then Macy says that one of the things that makes people with lived experience feel like their participation is worthwhile is follow up with the youth, and that they love it when people follow up. And so you think about that we ask people to come for these meetings and they comment, but then we maybe don't follow back up with them, check in, let them know what the progress is, those kinds of things. And so that's really, I think, a useful thing. So thank you for that, Macy. And then, Mark, I'm going to ask you what you're seeing coming into chat from our audience.
One thing Susie mentions that it's valuable to have Hannah and Macy participating today, and I think it's very powerful to think that they started out on an individual level and working in the state of Oregon, and now they've ended up on a national webinar. So that's very powerful when you think about advocacy and the influence that they're making, and also Lisa's support of that in the progressive nature of that in the state of Oregon, that how it's actually just translated into a national webinar. So just that's very impressive to me.
I think so too.
I want to also just point out what Lisa mentioned about additional ways to encourage their participation in terms of getting them clothing that they will feel comfortable in, and getting them, either stipends as cash, and help them, offer opportunities to share their thoughts via writing as well, not always necessarily verbally.
Yeah, I think certainly with people with lived experience, because they don't talk this talk all of the time, giving them information ahead of time so they can prepare, so they know the kinds of questions you're going to be asking them to respond to, like we did for this webinar, I think can be really a helpful, really basic thing that we sometimes maybe forget about when we ask people to participate.
And it looks like I'll also add, Amy mentioned that they engage families by staying in contact, like we just mentioned, checking on them, and also sending them resources and information on webinars.
And then I also like how Amy also mentions that when we're thinking about working with people, sometimes we might be asking maybe too much, and it's okay to give them space to practice some self-care. And sometimes they might have to say no, and that's okay. So lots of folks are feeling really good about following up. And I think that you can get better information sometimes in that follow-up than you can get in that initial burst when people are maybe feeling nervous about being part of a group, or giving feedback in the kind of a legislative way. So when you do that follow-up, I think it can be an enriching experience both for the user and then for the project as well. All right, so I did say we would just go over by a couple of minutes, so we have about 3 minutes left, and so I know our final thoughts are going to take slightly longer than that. So I'm going to ask for final thoughts, and Andrew, did you want to start our final thoughts today?
Sure, thanks. I just wanted to emphasize the importance and the value of including people with lived experiences in your court improvement efforts. Just the experience of going through the court, regardless of the circumstances that may have brought them there, is worth gathering feedback on. Consider something like an exit survey for folks going through the court process, almost like a customer satisfaction survey, and finding out ways that their experience can help guide your court improvement efforts. In terms of what we have on the slide here today, this future reading opportunities, there are a lot of great ways there for future reading to enrich the discussion on how to include individuals with lived experiences in your efforts. There are also 2 web links specifically in the web links pod on the right-hand side of the screen, Foster Youth Action website and the Foster Club website. Both of those websites are a great place if you're just beginning to start and you're looking to find out, for instance, where you might find foster youth to include, former foster youth to include.
All right, and I think you're totally right. There are lots of resources, and people think about this a lot. And so there are resources out there, and you can contact us or Google for resources. Mark, did you have anything you wanted to add for your final thought?
Just really that there's a national movement for peer support, and usually every state has a peer association or a state agency that fosters mental health and addiction peer support. So that's one big resource that courts can tap into to find adults and maybe even young people, that are connected to sober schools or recovery schools, high schools, to bring in people to help support, youth and adults. And also with regard to mental health peer recovery, it's really been around for a long time. There's clubhouses that are available and community centers, and also lots of available support from organizations like NAMI, the National Association for Mental Illness, and also Mental Health of America, which either from a national level or from a local level. So that's what I would wrap up with.
Thanks, Mark. I think those are great ideas, and really focusing on a part of the system that we don't always talk about, which are those folks with mental health challenges. And I did, in fact, save the best for last here because I wanted to end with our voices from the users. And so I'm going to ask Macy to type in chat their final thoughts. And Hannah, I'm going to call on you now to give us your final thoughts.
Yeah. So I appreciate everyone being a part of this. I like that you're wanting to listen to the lived experience, or the people who have a lived experience and what they have to say. And I guess my final it's kind of like a question, but it's just asking, like, are there issues or improvements needed in your system? Of course, we know that. So you should really be asking the people directly impacted by the decisions of your agency what those problems are and how they think they could be solved. Like, who would be better to ask for feedback from than those who stand to lose the most should you make the wrong decision? So that is just one thing I would say, is continually ask for feedback from people with lived experience, and lift up those voices of the people who are the experts in this field, just because they've lived through it and they know what it's like. They're going to give you the best perspective possible.
I think that's a really great point, Hannah, that people with lived experience really are experts in their own lives, and experts a lot of times in how the system looks from the other side, which you can't really see if you're part of it. And so I'm going to read Macy's final thought, and then we'll be done. Macy says, if you don't include youth voices, how are you really going to know the internal issues, the ones you don't see on the surface or on paper, and how will those issues be solved? You can't fix or mend a broken system without figuring out the root issues and tackling them head on. The youth are not the problem 97% of the time. A lot of it is environmental, and if you just take 30 seconds to pay attention, you will learn so much about even if they're safe. And that is a great note to end on. And so I'd like to thank everybody for being part of our webinar today. I would very much like to thank our two youth with lived experience, Anna and Macy. I really appreciate you guys getting on, taking the time out of your day. And Lisa, I appreciate you participating as well. And to our panelists, thanks everybody.